They say the earth remembers, not through stories or symbols but through vibration. Every scream, every prayer, every unburied secret leaves a resonance that never dies. And if you walk through southeastern Ohio on a windless night, you'll feel it under your feet, the pulse of something that should have been left buried. The locals call it the Field of Grace, but those who know the truth whisper another name, the Coleman ground. It began with a man who believed he could rewrite the laws of faith. Elder Daniel Coleman, preacher, builder, parasite. He arrived in 1837 claiming divine purpose, but what he really brought was a structure of control so sophisticated that even modern systems still echo its design. He understood the psychology of surrender, how men, hungry for meaning, will give everything to anyone who promises salvation. When Coleman first stepped onto that 400-acre valley, the soil was rich, the air still, and the people of Athens County were desperate for order. America was young and wild. Faith was currency, and obedience was the price of belonging. He saw opportunity where others saw wilderness. The moment his boots sank into that damp Ohio earth, he whispered, "This is where the new world begins." But what began there was something else entirely, the marker that stands today. That weathered stone cross with its faded inscription is not a monument to faith. It's a seal, a warning disguised as reverence. Beneath it, the ground is riddled with hollow chambers, forgotten foundations, and tunnels that lead nowhere because they were never meant to. They were built to hide what should not have existed. In those tunnels, people prayed for freedom and called it worship. They believed Elder Coleman spoke the language of heaven. They didn't know he was writing his own scripture, one etched in hunger, exhaustion, and blood. You see, every age has its Colemans. Every system has its false prophets who preach unity while feeding on submission. The difference is only scale. What happened in that Ohio valley was not an anomaly. It was a prototype, the first modern experiment in psychological captivity, disguised as divine order. And if you think that experiment ended when the Coleman family vanished into history, you haven't been listening closely enough. Daniel Coleman didn't rise to power by brute force. He built his empire the way all lasting tyrannies are built, through belief. He knew the human mind craves purpose more than pleasure, structure more than freedom. So he offered both, wrapped in the illusion of divine love. That's how every cage is built, not from iron, but from the promise of safety. When he spoke, people wept. When he touched their hands, they felt chosen. He didn't need to shout or threaten. His power was quiet, deliberate, surgical. The people who came to him were lost. Widows, failed farmers, broken soldiers, outcasts of a nation chasing its manifest destiny. Coleman promised them a rebirth, a new Eden, untainted by corruption, where all would live as one body under God. But he never said who that body would serve. His sermons were masterworks of psychological engineering. He understood rhythm, tone, and repetition. He repeated his phrases until they bypassed resistance and became law in the listener's mind. The flesh is weak. The spirit must be ruled. Say it often enough, and a man begins to crave his own domination. Coleman weaponized scripture the way generals weaponize soldiers, to conquer the soul. The new canon community began with 30 followers. Within 5 years, it was 200. Each family surrendered their possessions for the glory of God. Each child was registered as property of the faith. Slowly, their world narrowed until Elder Coleman's word became their weather, their clock, their only truth. But here's the part they never taught in the history books. Coleman's real genius wasn't in what he took. It was in what he gave back. He granted his followers the comfort of certainty. No more chaos, no more doubt, no more decisions. Only obedience. It was intoxicating. Once they surrendered their will, they stopped suffering, at least for a while. Modern power structures still use this same blueprint. Corporations, governments, even ideologies. control through purpose, submission disguised as belonging. Coleman wasn't just a preacher. He was the prototype of the managerial mind, centuries ahead of his time. They called him elder. But in secret, his family called him architect. Because what he was building wasn't a community, it was a system, one that would outlive them all. At the center of New Canaan stood the Coleman house, red brick, 2 stories, built like a fortress against the wilderness. To outsiders, it looked like a home of discipline and prayer. To those who lived beneath its shadow, it was a throne of control. Every board, every window, every echo of that house was part of Daniel Coleman's design. It was more than shelter. It was the operating system of his dominion. By day, its windows reflected sunlight like eyes watching from above. By night, they glowed faintly, candlelight flickering behind drawn curtains, while the rest of the valley lay in darkness. People whispered that the Colemans never slept, that voices murmured through the halls, long after midnight, prayers that didn't sound quite holy. Some swore they saw figures moving behind the attic glass, tall and still, like statues waiting to breathe. Inside, the family ruled in perfect order. Sarah Coleman, Mother Sarah, as she demanded to be called, oversaw every woman and child in the community. She preached purity, humility, and service, yet her hands bore rings of gold, and her table was never empty. Joshua, the eldest son, was his father's shadow, the enforcer who rationed food and punished disobedience. Rebecca, beautiful and detached, managed correspondence and confessions, her soft voice often the last thing a sinner heard before being purified. And little Ezra, only 12, memorized every ritual, every punishment, his laughter echoing through the halls as if cruelty were a family hymn. The Coleman home became microcosm of their theology. Every rule below reflected a ritual above. Coleman called it the order of divine proportion. Every punishment mirrored a blessing. Every sacrifice had its opposite reward. It was symmetry, cold, absolute, mathematical. The people believed it was sacred geometry. But in truth, it was behavioral conditioning, the slow rewiring of the human will. They held their most secret gatherings beneath the house, in a chamber carved from the stone foundation. Only the most faithful were ever invited below. What happened there was said to strip away the last layer of doubt, to cleanse the soul of rebellion. But no one who descended into that room came back unchanged. The Coleman house didn't just hold a family, it held a machine, one powered by submission, built to turn belief into currency and worship into obedience. Beneath the Coleman house, where the air turned damp and the walls blood condensation, there was a chamber few ever saw twice. They called it the cleansing room. Officially, it was a place of prayer, a sanctum for those who had strayed from righteousness. In truth, it was a laboratory of control. Every ritual that occurred there was designed not to purify the soul, but to fracture it. When a follower was accused of sin, sloth, doubt, private thought, they were summoned after midnight. 2 of Coleman's sons would appear at their cabin door with a single lantern. The accused would be led through the house in silence, down a staircase that spiraled into the earth. The sound of their footsteps would change as they descended. From wood to stone, from freedom to captivity. By the time they reached the bottom, they no longer remembered why they had ever believed in mercy. Inside the chamber, a wooden chair sat beneath an iron cross bolted to the wall. It wasn't a symbol of salvation. It was an anchor for fear. Coleman would stand before the trembling soul and speak softly, almost lovingly. He never shouted. He didn't need to. His words moved like blades dipped in honey. Confession is the first light, he would say, but obedience is the fire that cleanses. 3 hours passed in that room. No one outside knew what was said or done, but when the door finally opened, the person who emerged was never the same. Their eyes seemed hollowed, their voice quieter, as if something sacred had been extracted. Some would begin to smile constantly, even when alone, Others stopped speaking altogether, and those who couldn't be fixed were never seen again. Coleman kept meticulous notes about these sessions, not in his Bible, but in a leather ledger he called the Book of Refinement. It wasn't about faith, it was data. He measured human will like a scientist. How far could he push before the mind broke? How easily could guilt be transformed into loyalty? Each subject was a step toward perfect obedience, a formula that would later echo in institutions far larger than his farm. The cleansing room wasn't an isolated atrocity, it was a prototype, a psychological crucible where one man discovered how to make humans worship their own captivity. It always begins the same way, with a question whispered in the wrong ear. One voice cracks the silence, and suddenly the illusion trembles. At New Canaan, that voice belonged to Anna Thompson, a widow whose eyes saw through the pageantry of holiness. She had lost her husband to Coleman's divine will, and her son to exhaustion, yet she never stopped watching. While others bowed their heads in prayer, she studied the patterns: who was taken, who was rewarded, and who vanished after descending into the cleansing room. Coleman taught that doubt was the devil's whisper, but what if that whisper was truth's first sound? Anna began collecting fragments, scraps of letters, pieces of cloth marked with initials, trinkets stolen from the dead. She kept them hidden beneath her floorboards, forming a secret archive of the unholy. What she was building wasn't rebellion, not yet. It was awareness, and awareness is the seed of every revolution. She wasn't alone for long. 2 others joined her: Margaret Foster, whose daughter had disappeared after being chosen for service in the main house, and Jacob Miller, a quiet man who had once been a teacher before Coleman stripped him of that title. Together, they formed what they called the Rememberers. Their mission was simple: to remember what Coleman forced others to forget. They met in silence, speaking through symbols carved into tree trunks at the edge of the forest. Circles crossed with lines, triangles with missing corners. To outsiders it was meaningless. To them it was survival. But rebellion inside a system built on fear requires more than courage. It requires faith in oneself, a faith Coleman had spent years erasing. Anna understood this, and so she began something dangerous. She started to speak differently during prayer. Subtly, quietly, phrases that planted questions in the minds of others. Instead of, "Thy will be done," she'd say, "Whose will is this we serve?" The first time she said it aloud, even the air seemed to freeze. Soon after, Coleman's sermons grew darker. He could feel the shift, the tremor in obedience. He began watching the faces in the crowd more closely, sensing that his perfect order was fracturing. Fear turned to rage, and rage, when wrapped in faith, becomes holy violence. Anna didn't know it yet, but she had triggered something unstoppable: the awakening of doubt in a world built on worship. Coleman had always preached that fear was the beginning of wisdom. But when rebellion stirred beneath his empire of faith, he redefined that scripture into law. Fear was no longer a tool. It became the doctrine itself. The pulpit transformed into a stage of intimidation. Every sermon, every hymn, every ritual was recalibrated to remind his followers that even the smallest doubt was treason against God. He began with the simplest act of controlled isolation. Those suspected of spiritual weakness were removed from their families without warning. No explanation, no farewell. Coleman told the congregation that these souls had entered the trial of silence, a sacred purification. The truth was far simpler. They were being erased. Sometimes their empty cabins were left untouched for weeks, the doors still swinging in the wind, a message carved into the wood: "He sees all." The cleansing room filled nightly now. People volunteered themselves before suspicion could find them. They begged for punishment just to prove their loyalty. Coleman had inverted the human spirit, turned submission into virtue, self-erasure into salvation, and the more his followers suffered, the holier they felt. That was his true genius. He made pain feel like proof of righteousness. He divided the community into ranks, each one policing the other. Mothers reported on husbands. Children reported on parents. The system devoured trust until only obedience remained. Coleman called it the hierarchy of light. But in practice, it was a cage made of guilt. And yet his sermons grew more desperate. Beneath the calm cadence of his voice, cracks were forming. He spoke longer, louder, often repeating himself, as though he feared the silence more than his flock did. Some nights, villagers swore they heard him arguing alone in the chapel, answering voices no one else could hear. His family noticed too. Joshua began to patrol the settlement with a loaded rifle. Rebecca kept a dagger in her prayer book. Even Sarah locked her door at night. Coleman's paradise was rotting from within. But rot is quiet. It spreads in secret, unseen until the structure collapses, and deep beneath the earth, where the air smelled of dust and iron, the followers who still dared to think began to understand a forbidden truth. That the God they worshipped might be no higher than the man who enslaved them. It began with silence, not the obedient quiet Coleman demanded during prayer, but a hollow, unfamiliar silence that carried through the valley, the kind that follows when belief starts to die. His followers still knelt, still mouthed his verses, but something vital had gone missing. Their eyes no longer glowed with reverence. They stared through him now, as if waiting for the mask to fall. Coleman felt it instantly. Control, once absolute, was slipping like sand through his fingers. He doubled his sermons, expanded his punishments, but every act of dominance only exposed his desperation. The God he invoked had stopped answering. Perhaps he never had. Perhaps Coleman had mistaken the echo of his own hunger for the voice of the divine. Rumors spread through the cabins. The sickness that had taken so many the previous winter had not been divine judgment but poison. The food was tainted, the water fouled. Some said they'd seen Joshua burying barrels behind the barn under cover of darkness. Others whispered that Rebecca herself had chosen the victims. The ones most likely to question, the ones whose strength frightened her father. Fear no longer unified them, it divided them. Anna Thompson, watching from the edges, felt the shift. Her words had planted deeper than she imagined. One night, during evening prayer, she noticed several members deliberately omit Coleman's name from the final blessing. A small act, invisible to most. But in a regime built on absolute devotion, it was rebellion of the highest order. The next morning, Coleman ordered a gathering at the main field. He stood upon the raised platform, eyes blazing, the Bible in his hands trembling as if the pages burned. "There is a serpent among us," he declared, "and it hides in the hearts of those who have forgotten that obedience is salvation." His gaze swept the crowd. No one spoke. No one breathed. That night 3 cabins burned to the ground. The screams echoed into the hills, and the flames reflected against the black sky like judgment made flesh. Coleman called it a cleansing, but the people saw it for what it was. Fear wearing scripture as armor. From that night forward, no one prayed aloud. No one trusted a shadow. The fracture had opened. The faith was bleeding out. The night after the burnings, the valley smelled of smoke and salt. The wind carried the ashes of those cabins across the crops, coating every stalk and leaf in a thin gray film. It was as if the land itself had gone into mourning. Coleman stood before the smoldering ruins at dawn, his face lit by the last glowing embers. To the crowd gathered around him, he said only, "Fire purifies." But the people didn't nod as they once had. They only stared. That morning marked a shift. The fear that had bound them began to harden into something sharper. Not courage yet, but resolve. When everything you love has burned, there's nothing left to lose. Anna Thompson watched the smoke rise and whispered to Margaret, "If he can call this holy, then holiness is the disease." Those words, carried on breath and rumor, spread faster than fire ever could. At first, their rebellion was simple survival. The rememberers began moving food, medicine, and documents at night. They smuggled old letters from Coleman's study, transcripts of the cleansing room rituals, and lists of the chosen who had vanished. Each page was proof that the divine order was only human cruelty, written, catalogued, and systematized. But rebellion needs more than truth. It needs an act. Jacob Miller was the first to break the sacred boundary. He had been one of Coleman's record keepers before his exile. He knew where the ledgers were stored, in a locked chest in the chapel's lower chamber. One moonless night, he returned. He moved through the corridors barefoot, his breath shallow, each step echoing against the hollow floor. When he reached the chest, he hesitated. He could still hear Coleman's voice in his head, promising damnation to all who questioned him. But Jacob had already seen hell. He took the ledger and fled. By dawn, the Book of Refinement was in Anna's hands. The pages were filled with names, dates, methods, a record of obedience through terror. It wasn't faith, it was data, and within it lay the formula of control Coleman had spent decades perfecting. Anna realized the truth then. His power didn't come from divinity. It came from understanding human weakness too well. When Coleman discovered the theft, he didn't rage. He smiled. "Now," he said quietly, "they will learn what it costs to challenge the design." Coleman had always preferred subtlety, the quiet terror of suggestion, the elegance of obedience. But when he learned the ledger was gone, something inside him snapped. The mask of the preacher fell, revealing the architect beneath, a man who saw human life as pieces on a board. If they wished to challenge his system, then he would remind them what the cost of defiance truly was. At sunrise, the bell rang, a sound that once called the faithful to prayer. This time, it summoned them to witness. The villagers gathered in the field, their faces pale and hollow. At the center stood a scaffold newly built overnight, its wood still raw, the rope swaying softly in the wind. Coleman stood beside it, the Bible in one hand, his staff in the other. "Every design must be tested," he declared, every imperfection burned away. His eyes swept the crowd and landed on Jacob Miller, bound, beaten, dragged before the people he'd once taught to read. Coleman's voice softened. Jacob sought knowledge without permission. He believed understanding was freedom. But freedom is the language of the serpent. No one dared move. No one dared breathe. Coleman turned to Joshua, his eldest son. "Show them mercy through obedience." The sound of the trapdoor echoed through the valley. One sharp crack, followed by silence. The body hung motionless, framed against the rising sun. Coleman closed his Bible and whispered, "Now the balance is restored." But it wasn't. Something had shifted, not in favor of fear, but against it. The people didn't scream. They didn't cry. They only stared, their eyes dry, their hearts calcified. Anna felt it first. The numbness of terror giving way to a colder emotion, calculation. The memory of Jacob's hanging didn't frighten them into submission. It etched into their minds the simple truth that Coleman would never stop until he was stopped. That night, Anna opened the Book of Refinement again. Between its pages, she found patterns, numbers, rotations of names and punishments that formed more than just a record. It was a cycle, an algorithm of control. Coleman had turned faith into a formula, and formulas could be broken. Outside, in the field where Jacob had hung, the rope still swayed in the night wind. But it wasn't fear it carried anymore. It was momentum. The rebellion no longer whispered. It had begun to breathe. For weeks, Anna studied the Book of Refinement by candlelight, tracing Coleman's handwriting until her fingers blackened with soot. The ledger was more than a confession. It was a machine. Every ritual, every punishment, every disappearance followed a pattern so precise it could not have been chance. Coleman's genius wasn't his cruelty, it was his mathematics. He had mapped submission. Each entry was coded. The victims' names were paired with numbers, sometimes 3, sometimes 7, sometimes 9. always repeating in sequences that aligned with the lunar calendar. The intervals between cleansings formed a rhythm: doubt, confession, penance, renewal. It was behavioral choreography. He'd conditioned an entire community to obey through ritualized trauma, perfectly timed to keep them exhausted, grateful, and afraid. Anna began to see the pattern everywhere. In the bells that rang before sunrise, in the alternating days of fasting and feasting, in the cadence of Coleman's sermons. Even emotion was scheduled. People were never allowed to feel freely. They were trained to feel on cue. And within that rhythm lay the key to control predictability. Coleman ruled not through mystery, but through timing. So she inverted the sequence. If fear thrived on predictability, rebellion would thrive on chaos. She and Margaret began altering routines, delaying morning prayers by minutes, shifting the order of hymns, spreading small rumors that contradicted Coleman's teachings. It started subtly, imperceptibly. A missed chant here, a skipped confession there. But soon, the rhythm faltered. The system began to stutter. The first visible break came during a sermon. Coleman raised his hand to begin the collective prayer, but the response came late. Fractured, uncertain. For the first time, his timing failed. His control depended on synchronization, and now, his congregation was out of sync. He felt it instantly. Like a musician playing to an audience that no longer heard the beat. He slammed his hand against the pulpit, the echo shattering the stillness. "You hesitate," he hissed. "You invite the shadow among you." But his voice, once absolute, trembled. That night, the rememberers gathered beneath the old sycamore. Anna placed the ledger in the center. "He built a pattern to enslave us," she said. "Now we'll use it to end him." In the darkness, the wind shifted. It no longer carried prayers. It carried intention. The order was breaking, and the chaos had only begun. When control begins to slip, the first to sense it are always those who depend on it most. Inside the Coleman household, the fractures that had been forming for years finally began to split the family apart. For the first time, the rulers of New Canaan feared one another more than they feared the world beyond their fence. Joshua Coleman, the eldest, had once believed in his father's divine right as fiercely as he believed in breath itself. But since the night of Jacob's execution, his hands had begun to shake. He told himself it was exhaustion, yet in the quiet moments, when the fields were still and the wind carried faint echoes of screams long buried, he felt something deeper: guilt. He had seen Jacob's eyes before the rope dropped. There had been no fear there, only pity. And that haunted him. Rebecca watched him unravel. From her window, she saw him pacing the barn at night, muttering prayers that no longer made sense. She had her own doubts, though she would never speak them aloud. Her loyalty to her father wasn't faith. It was survival. She'd learned that even silence could be dangerous if her timing was wrong. Mother Sarah, however, had no doubts. She saw rebellion everywhere. In every shadow, every whisper. She believed the sickness in the people's hearts was divine punishment, not the product of Coleman's cruelty. While her husband's sermons grew erratic, her devotion intensified. She began organizing secret vigils, forcing women and children to kneel for hours, chanting until their voices broke. If Daniel was the mind of the order, Sarah was its will, unyielding, merciless, burning with holy fire. But Daniel himself was unraveling faster than anyone. He stopped sleeping. He stopped eating. He began seeing patterns that weren't there, drawing circles and lines on the walls with charcoal, muttering about the alignment, the coming moment when God would separate the faithful from the damned. To him, the chaos Anna had seeded was proof not of rebellion, but of prophecy. He believed the world was preparing to test him, and that only through sacrifice could order be restored. Joshua began drinking. Rebecca began planning. Sarah began praying louder, and Daniel began building something beneath the chapel. A new altar, carved from black stone, large enough for a body. The family that had once ruled in perfect unity was now a house of trembling loyalties, each one waiting for the other to fall first. The digging began before dawn. From the village, the followers heard the dull rhythm of shovels striking earth, each thud echoing through the valley like a heartbeat beneath the ground. Coleman's sons worked in silence, their faces pale and hollow, while lanterns swung from the rafters of the chapel above. Daniel directed every motion, his voice soft, reverent, the voice of a man convinced he was completing the work of God himself. By nightfall, the floor of the chapel had been torn open, revealing a pit lined with black stone, polished to a mirror sheen. At its center rose the new altar, taller than a man, carved with symbols none recognized. Circles intersecting triangles, numbers repeating in patterns that seemed to move. When the candlelight shifted, it wasn't a place of worship. It was geometry made into a cage. Coleman called it the altar of alignment. He told his congregation that the world had fallen into corruption, that even the faithful among them carried the seed of rebellion. Only through a final offering could balance be restored. He promised that the chosen sacrifice would cleanse them all, uniting their souls with divine order. No one spoke, but every heart in the chapel beat with dread. They had seen what Coleman's cleansing meant. The next day, he announced that God himself would reveal the name of the chosen. He began calling members forward, one by one, pressing his hand to their foreheads as if feeling for divine heat. When he reached Anna Thompson, his hand lingered longer than the rest. His eyes flickered, recognition, fury, maybe even respect. But he said nothing. Instead, he turned away, smiling faintly. "The Lord chooses in silence," he said. That night, he locked himself inside the chapel. Those who passed by claimed to hear chanting, the kind that didn't sound like scripture. Guttural, rhythmic, mathematical. Smoke poured through the cracks in the door, and strange light glowed from below the floorboards, as though the stones themselves had begun to burn. By dawn, Coleman emerged pale and trembling, his eyes rimmed with red. "The hour has come," he whispered. "The alignment is near." Behind him, the new altar pulsed faintly, as if alive. In the village below, the remembers made their decision. If Coleman's altar demanded a sacrifice, they would ensure it was not one of their own. The night they chose to strike, the moon hung low and blood colored over the valley. A bad omen for those who still believed in signs, but Anna saw it as justice made visible. Every step through the frost-bitten fields was calculated, every breath silent. The rememberers moved like shadows between the cabins, their faces streaked with ash to dull the glint of sweat and fear. They were farmers, widows, and laborers, not soldiers, yet something in them had hardened beyond human fear. The years of sermons, the punishments, the graves had carved their resolve deeper than any blade could reach. Anna led them toward the chapel. Its door stood open, spilling a pale light that shimmered unnaturally, like moonlight refracted through water. Inside, Coleman stood before the altar, his arms raised. His children knelt in a semicircle, chanting words that made the air vibrate. Beneath their feet, the black stone pulsed like a heartbeat, each thrum sensing with the rhythm of their voices. Coleman turned as Anna entered, his eyes bright with manic triumph. "You are late, Sister Anna," he said softly. "The alignment begins, and you still cling to the flesh." She raised the rifle taken from a guard's quarters. "No more sermons." Coleman smiled, not in mockery but pity. "Do you think bullets can wound what is already consecrated?" The remembers fanned out, lighting torches dipped in animal fat. The smell filled the chapel, cutting through the incense and decay. Coleman's children rose, Joshua gripping a rusted blade, Rebecca clutching a book wrapped in skin. But as they advanced, the altar began to hum. The walls shook. Candles flickered out. From beneath the floor came a low moan. Hundreds of voices, the trapped prayers of the dead. Anna shouted for them to burn it. Flames caught the drapes, raced along the rafters. Rebecca screamed as the fire reached the altar's base. Coleman lunged toward it, arms outstretched, but Anna fired. The shot hit his chest. He staggered, then fell backward onto the black stone, which cracked beneath his body, releasing a sound that wasn't thunder but release. The fire roared. The ceiling collapsed. And in that chaos, the voices rose, no longer crying, but sighing, as if finally freed. Outside, the survivors watched the chapel burn, the light reflecting in their hollow eyes. Anna whispered, "The alignment is undone." But deep in the smoke, something still pulsed. Faint, deliberate, waiting. When dawn broke over the valley, the chapel was gone. Only a blackened skeleton remained, charred beams jutting upward like ribs around an open wound. The air still shimmered with heat, carrying the faint, metallic scent of burnt earth. The rememberers stood in silence, the weight of victory pressing heavier than the years of fear that came before it. The Coleman family was finished. Or so they thought. Anna walked through the ashes, her boots sinking into the suit. Beneath the wreckage, the altar had collapsed inward, but not entirely. Fragments of its stone were scattered, still warm to the touch. Each shard pulsed faintly, as though holding on to something that refused to die. She knelt beside one, the largest piece, and saw that the carving still moved under the light, shifting like something alive trying to remember its form. Behind her, Joshua's voice cut through the silence. Hoarse, but clear. "You shouldn't touch it." He stood at the edge of the ruin, burned but alive, half his face blistered. The rifle came up instantly, but he didn't move to attack. He just stared at the stone. Father said it would bind him beyond death. He whispered, said that when flesh burned, the spirit would find new vessels, new architects. Anna's grip tightened on the rifle. "He's gone, Joshua." The Joshua smiled faintly, not the smile of a believer, but of a man already doomed. "No, he's listening." He stepped forward, placed his hand on the glowing shard, and screamed. His body convulsed as the markings flared bright white, the smell of burning flesh mixed with the scent of iron. And then he was still. When Anna turned him over, his eyes were glassy, but the faintest twitch lingered at the corner of his mouth, as though something inside had only just begun to breathe. By nightfall, the others noticed changes too. The livestock refused to go near the ruins. The stream that ran behind the farm had turned dark, thick, sluggish, metallic, and in the still hours before dawn, the survivors swore they heard voices again. Not cries this time, but whispers. Rhythmic, familiar, the same cadence Coleman used when he preached. Anna knew what it meant. The fire had freed the souls, yes, but it had also awakened something older, something that had used Coleman, not the other way around. The altar wasn't destroyed, it had simply moved on, into them. It began with the dreams. The first night after the fire, Anna saw the chapel standing again, whole, untouched by flame. She walked through its doors and found the altar waiting, unbroken, humming like a heart. A voice whispered from somewhere deep within the stone. The alignment was never the altar. It was you. She woke screaming, her hands clawing at her chest, certain she'd feel it beating beneath her ribs. By the third night, others confessed the same visions. Some saw Coleman himself, walking through the ruins, his blue eyes glowing with calm divinity. Others dreamed of endless corridors built from the black stone, each step echoing the same phrase. Order through sacrifice. Those who resisted the pull awoke bleeding from the nose, shaking uncontrollably. Those who embraced it awoke serene and silent. Anna tried to hold them together, but something had fractured the survivors. Men who once fought at her side now knelt before the ashes at dusk, murmuring prayers in tongues that hadn't been heard since before Scripture had names. The rhythm of Coleman's voice had become a pulse in the air. In the creak of trees, the drip of rain, the beat of their own hearts. One night, Anna found Margaret Foster standing barefoot in the ruins, humming softly. "He's almost ready," Margaret said, her voice hollow. "He promised us rest. He just needs to be remembered." That word, remembered, chilled Anna to her core. It was the same word they'd claimed as their rebellion. But now it had turned inward, coiling like a snake devouring its tail. She fled the valley at sunrise, leaving behind the few who still breathed. As she crossed the Hawking River, she looked back one final time. The smoke had cleared, but in its place rose a faint shimmer, a mirage of light bending over the ruins, forming the outline of a steeple. The chapel was rebuilding itself, piece by piece, not in wood or stone, but in memory, in belief. Some nights, years later, travelers still hear hymns on the wind near that valley. Not the hymns of salvation, but of alignment, of surrender. They say if you listen long enough, you'll start to hear your own name among the choir. And if you whisper it back, you won't stop, not until the altar inside you finally wakes.